and welcome to the third section of the class. So if you remember from earlier in the semester, we started out with talking about the basic underlying expectations of our system, so talking about the history and the Constitution, and then we spent time talking about the actual politics, the things that connect people to government, and that's what you just took your exam over. Now we're moving into the institutions of government. So this is the last section of the course, which is shorter now because of our quarantine situations, is going to cover Congress, the executive branch and presidency, and the courts. And so we're going to start out this week by talking about Congress. You just saw a video by Ron Elving of NPR about one of the key underlying issues with Congress, which is that people hate Congress. We have like single-digit approval ratings, and that's been true for for almost 20 years at least. And so it's not simply a function of who's in charge. It's not a partisan issue. It's just in general, people hate Congress, but they tend to love their own member of Congress, and that's why incumbency rates are so high. And so we're going to spend a lot of time this week just thinking through the structure of Congress, like how they do things in order to better understand the system. And then we will spend a little bit of time talking about how particularly today, we're going to talk about how the members make decisions and what goes on as they look at their job as a member of Congress. So let's first talk about Congress itself. This stuff is kind of the easy, basic part. It fits in with our other conversations about the Constitution and the powers that are granted by the Constitution. And so we talk about the enumerated powers again, right? So remember from our lectures on the Constitution itself that many of the things that we think of powers laid out for the national government are in fact powers given to Congress. Article 1 enumerated powers are all sorts of things, taxes and tariffs. Congress has the power to borrow money, to regulate commerce, to regulate citizenship and other kinds of cross-border things. So commerce inside the United States, citizenship and trade across borders. Article 1 also gives Congress the power of controlling banking and currency. They give Congress control over the post office, which for us doesn't necessarily seem like a big deal, but was a huge deal at the time, and was basically the way that people communicated was through the mail. It gives Congress the power to deal with copyrights. Congress and Congress alone has the power to declare war. We'll talk more about foreign policy and war powers when we talk about the presidency. Congress has the power to raise and outfit an army. And it's Congress's job to govern the District of Columbia, which is sort of a strange thing when you think about it. But initially, right, there wasn't a city there. They built a brand new city in order to have the nation's capital. So even though it has a city today, which has a mayor and a council and a school district and all those kinds of things, it is still considered to be a special function of Congress to oversee, basically now, the government of the District of Columbia. So now the thing is that we know that those are not the only things that Congress is doing, right? No. This is where the necessary and proper clause comes in again. So remember that from our conversation about the Constitution, right? So the way that Congress's duties are set up is that it says Congress has the power to do all these things, and then anything necessary and proper in order to carry out the duties laid out in the enumerated clause, in the enumerated powers section. So what this means is that Congress does a lot of stuff, right? And Congress plays a bunch of different kinds of roles. And so what ended up happening is there are all of these kind of evolutionary processes that have taken place in Congress. So some of that is about how members of Congress themselves operate, but some of it is also about the institution. So the institutional stuff will come later when we talk about congressional committees and the leadership roles in Congress. But basically, what we know is that over time, members of Congress have had to become more and more expert on a whole wide variety of things. And that's why they need information, which links us back to our conversation about things like interest groups and lobbying, right? So one of the reasons that lobbying and special interests are so powerful is because members of Congress need information. They need better and more accurate information in order to do their jobs well. And one of the other sort of evolutionary processes that has gone on in the institution of Congress is in order to help settle conflict. Now, does that sound familiar, right? Evolution, settling conflict, right? Yeah, it's politics, right? And so lots of the political parts of the interactions among members of Congress are designed to help settle conflict both among themselves, but also to settle societal conflicts between big states and little states, conflicts between resource-rich states and those that don't have many resources, all these kinds of things. So Congress has an enormous amount of power, but I think maybe the easiest way to think about this, how to break this down, is to, coordinating activity. Yep, same thing, politics. And we know the constitutional differences between the House and Senate. That shouldn't be a big shock. We looked at some of this. We talked about elections. Senate has a 6-year term. The House has a 2-year term. Their elections operate differently. The next lecture video will talk about congressional elections. The important thing here are the unique powers down at the bottom. So even though those kind of enumerated powers are laid out for Congress as a whole, right, the Senate is explicitly responsible for advice and consent, meaning to approve or to confirm judicial nominees in the federal system, including the Supreme Court, and also upper level executive branch appointees. So this is things like cabinet officials, heads of other kinds of independent executive agencies, heads of the councils that head up things like the Securities and Exchange Commission. All of those have to be confirmed by the Senate. The Senate also has that power for treaties. So the Senate plays a larger role in foreign policy than the House does. And then, of course, as we know, the Senate is the trial court for impeachment cases. The House is where any revenue bill, so any bill that increases the amount of revenue that the government brings in, so largely taxation bills, start in the House, and they must start in the House based on the rules, with the idea being that the House is the people's house, right? It's what's representing populations. And then, of course, the House brings impeachment charges. So given all that sort of complex set of enumerated powers and our expectation that based on the necessary and proper clause that Congress is doing a whole lot of different kinds of things, what I think the easiest way for us to think about this is to break down all of these things into 3 roles. So members of Congress, as they think about their job, so think about it this way, as they think about their job, each member has 3 roles. And so therefore, Congress as a whole sort of performs these 3 roles. And there are 3 big ones. The first one is lawmaking, so actually making the laws. The second is representation, so representation of their constituents. And the third is oversight, which is oversight of the executive branch to make sure that the laws that they have passed are being faithfully executed. So let's take these apart a little bit. Let's think about lawmaking. So what's lawmaking? Well, we're going to see later in this section about how a bill becomes a law, but that's the official process, right? Understanding the committee process and where a bill goes when, that's important. But the other side of that is simply members of Congress trying to get bills passed, things that they care about, things that they are thinking about. So how do they do that, right? How do they operate within that structure of how a bill becomes a law to actually achieve the policy goals that they're looking for? Well, one of the things they do is called log rolling, and it kind of has a bad connotation, and you'll understand why when I explain this to you, but The metaphor that's going on here is like a log rolling down a hill, picking up things as it goes. I think you can also think of this as the cartoon snowball effect, rolling down the hill, picking up snow, getting bigger and bigger. And the reason that that's the metaphor is that the idea is that members of Congress basically trade things in order to get bills passed. Now, to some degree, that sounds like, oh, well, they're helping special interests. Yeah, they might be. But sometimes what is simply going on is that, so let's say, for example, there is a member of Congress who represents a rural district with a lot of farmers. Well, guess what? A member from a suburban district doesn't necessarily know a ton about agricultural bills, right? And vice versa, or about the needs of an agricultural district. And so they will work together to get the things done that they both need, right? So the member from an agricultural district promises to vote for something the suburban district wants, like a local transportation kind of bill, and the suburban one promises to vote for the agricultural bill. Right. So that's what the idea here is. That's one of the ways that you get things done is through log rolling, is by promising to vote for other people's bills if they'll vote for your bills. And the structure of Congress, particularly the party structure, helps this, right? Because if you are a member of a party, you're expected to support that party's bills. One of the other things that happens is that, and in fact, largely what we assume to be happening in Congress now, and pretty much over the past 10 to 15 years, is what we call gridlock, which basically means they don't get a whole lot done. And that's because they are not able to log roll. They're not able to make compromises. They're not able to do things to actually get bills passed. And so we call that gridlock because it's not laziness. It is a function of conflict. It's two groups sort of at odds and not able to make any kind of compromise to get things done. What does this mean? Well, it means that decision-making is slow. And even in contexts where we haven't thought of it as having true gridlock, decisions have still been slow. But here's the thing about that. That was the point. Congress is supposed to follow people's opinion, right? So the system that's set up, I mean, it's really complicated. And you're going to see that when we look at the how a bill becomes a law portion of the class. But it is just not possible for policy to move fast. And the founders set it up that way, partially because they wanted things to have stability. They wanted voters and citizens to be able to look around and say, okay, I know what's going to happen tomorrow. I know what the system is going to look like tomorrow. But that just means that we have to deal with slower policymaking. In fact, while many people have complained, it is honestly shocking how fast Congress got the stimulus bill passed for the COVID-19 recovery. And there's going to have to be more, and it's going to be just as complicated. And this is why, because the system is complicated, plus you've got 535 people, plus the president, trying to make these decisions together. So the other part of lawmaking, or the other way to think about what's going on in lawmaking, is that most members, and certainly the parties and leadership, have an agenda, right? Have a set of goals for what they want to achieve. And we've talked about like agenda setting, right? Like getting people to pay attention before. So the policy agenda in terms of usually who's in charge at any given time is what's important. What are we talking about? What are we paying attention to? And so where does it come from? Well, it comes from things like the president, honestly. Usually, in fact, there's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of political science research that particularly over the past 50 years, that it has been the president's agenda that has set the agenda for what people are talking about in Congress. That's been a little bit less true under President Trump, but that has more to do with the uniqueness of President Trump's leadership style than it does with than we think that it does in sort of long-term trends in terms of congressional decision-making. Lawmaking, or the policy agenda, can also come from a well-publicized event. Obviously, we're living through an event that's going to impact all of our lives for a very long time. And so it makes sense that Congress would have acted and have put COVID recovery on the top of the agenda. And then finally, member interest, right? There are some members of Congress for whom they have a primary, not necessarily a single interest, but a specific reason why they are in Congress or are working hard in Congress. And sometimes this is more obvious in the Senate. Sometimes it's about foreign policy, or there was a very famous senator from Georgia named Sam Nunn who spent most of his time working on military funding and coordination of the military services. So it's that kind of thing. So the policy agenda can also be based on member interest. Okay, so remember the second of these roles is a representation role. So that representation role is based on the people that they are representing. Well, but here's the thing. It's not necessarily super obvious what that representation actually means. So there's a couple different ways to think about the representation of a member's district. Now, the first way that we can think about it is through what we call delegate representation. Now, a delegate is someone who goes and takes basically goes with instructions to do something, right? So the idea behind delegate representation is that if everything they did was delegate representation, they would always ask their constituents. They would always do a public opinion poll before they voted. Now, there are times when delegate representation happens, but I think you can see where delegate representation is important in certain contexts, but in others it might not be, right? So there are other kind of way to think about representation is what's called the trustee kind of representation. And in this sense, the idea is that people are voting for a representative to go and make decisions for them. Not they're voting for a person to take their instructions, but they're voting for a person who will go and actually make those decisions. And the idea here is there's all sorts of things and ideas that members of Congress have to make decisions about that voters, constituents may not know anything about, and that they're trusting their member of Congress to make the right decision for them. And so what you can see is that's probably, and that's actually kind of probably the model that the founders were operating under, but that was before the age of instant information, instant communication, and the internet. So what's really going on here? Well, the reality is that most members of Congress operate under what's called a politico model. Now, the term politico I think can be pejorative, just like that's an epithet you yell at somebody when you think they're being too political, but it's how the political science literature describes this. And basically, what this means is that members of Congress generally act as a trustee because they don't need to or want to find out what their constituent thinks about everything. But for important, highly publicized decisions, they operate as a delegate. Why? And that just makes sense, right? So even if, you can vote on, well, let's go back to our original example, right? So if you're a member of Congress from a rural district with lots of farmers, right, they're not necessarily going to care a whole lot whether you vote for or against a transportation bill for light rail, right? But they are really going to care about whether or not you vote for agricultural subsidies, right? So you are acting as a trustee most of the time and a delegate when there are things that your constituency is really paying attention to. That's what a politico is. Now, we also can think about representation in terms of, it's either called symbolic representation or sociological representation. And this is a slightly different context, right? So the other three are really more about the specific decisions that a member is making. This kind of representation is more about who you are. And the question is, or the obvious question is, how is it that Congress does not reflect the demographic characteristics of the nation as a whole? Right. The most obvious, right, is the idea that there are 50% of the population is women and 50% of Congress is not women. Right. So if it's only, between 17 and 24%, depending on the year. So what does that mean? What does that do to a decision-making process, right? And so that's the question for lots of different kinds of people, is to understand how do we increase this sociological representation. And so what you can see here is that, so this is the 112th Congress, and the blue lines are percentage of the population in 2000. The red lines are the Senate, and the green lines are representation in the House. And so, yes, the women one is obvious, but it's also very obvious for other kinds of racial and ethnic minorities in the population. So that said, and we had a longer conversation before about women's representation, and there's actually a much more interesting conversation to be had about symbolic representation in state houses, because there's just more variation, and so you can compare it better. But that's a conversation for state politics. So let's think about overall, how do members of Congress then represent their districts? If there's all these parts going on, well, the other thing we have to recognize is that members of Congress are not simply representing the voters in their district. There are different levels of representation going on here. So this is the best graphic of this that I've ever seen. So they represent individual constituents, right? They represent the people who voted for them, or people who voted at all, or just adults in their district. They solve problems with government agencies. This is called casework. So the kind of representation that you get from your member of Congress, regardless of your party, regardless if you voted for them. If you have trouble with a federal agency, you have trouble with your VA benefits, you want to be appointed to a service academy, you talk to your member of Congress, right? That's individual constituent representation. And that's really important. That's an important part of their jobs. And members of Congress have local offices back in their district who that's all that they do, is they take care of this casework that's just about representing their district. But see, members of Congress are also representing the organized interests in their district, which is not just like interest groups and lobbyists, but it's the idea that in certain districts there are certain businesses that are very prominent, right? So in the district that covers the city of Cincinnati, right, it's important for that member who represented Steve Chabot to represent Procter & Gamble's interests, right? The big employers, the university's interests, the Bengals' interests, right? I mean, not that they make a whole lot of money right now, but that's the idea, is that the member is representing the district, not just the people in the district. And so then that also means the district as a whole. So they get federal projects, right? They get money for roads and bridges. They support policies to enhance the district's economic prosperity, right? So part of their job is to think of their district as a whole, in addition to all the individuals who are part of it. Okay, finally is congressional oversight. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because it's going to make more sense when we talk about the executive branch and the presidency, but what you need to know is that Congress makes laws, but executive branch agencies make regulations to help people follow those laws, right? So it's Congress's job to make sure that those regulations fit in with what they originally meant when they passed those laws, right? So this is what happens when there are committee investigations, right? So I'm trying to think of an example of one that I know about. Oh, well, their defense committees do all sorts of investigations and things like overspending in Defense Department contracts, right? That's part of their job, right? They gave the Defense Department money to spend, right? Because that's part of Congress's job. And so then they're making sure that it's being spent effectively for the American people. And they're also the ones who control agency budgets. And in some cases, as we'll see, the agencies actually report to Congress. There are regulatory agencies whose whole job it is to make sure that Congress's specific intentions on a particular policy are being carried out. But that will make more sense when we talk about that in the context of the executive branch. And signing off for now, the next lecture will be on congressional elections.